Welcome to Hanley Farm. Hanley Farm is the flagship venue of the Southern Oregon Historical Society. The farm has been continually farmed since the 1850s and is today an active center for agricultural learning and for education in the Rogue Valley, and has a constant series of events here, running from plant sales to Children's Heritage Days to Civil War reenactments to scarecrow building and wreath making. The area of the Rogue Valley was distinct because of its soils, and when settlers first arrived here in the early 1850s, they found what seemed to be a garden. It was even more of an attractive garden because the land was virtually free. The Donation Land Claims Act of December 1850 gave 160 acres to a single man, or 320 to a man and his wife. Hanley Farm is interesting because it wasn't either measure, it was 640. That's because two different families, the Clintons and the Weltons, settled here in 1852. They made a bundle by selling it to Michael Hanley for a fair figure in gold in 1856, and the two families together had 640. And it's 640 of the best bottomland in Southern Oregon, known as Central Point Sandy Loam. The type of farming that was done here by the early settlers on the fairly large plots was what was later called general farming, or it's actually mixed crop multi-use. The farms basically were designed for self-sufficiency, mostly because there were no markets. When the area was first settled up, there were only about 500 people living in Jacksonville and about 1,500 miners, 2,000 miners all over the hills. And that just wasn't a lot. The ground was so fertile that you could produce large amounts of vegetables or cereal grains or raise a large amount of cattle, but you had no place to sell it. Access to the outside world was very difficult. Came by wagon or mule back from Crescent City or from the far north through the Willamette Valley. As a result, farmers pretty much had to be subsistence farmers. They lived here, they survived, and they hardly got ahead. A few of the farmers did. And they did it by moving their crops to markets where they could be found, even if they weren't nearby or convenient. In the mid-50s, the New York Times reports that the farmers were bringing animals and fruits over the Siskiyou Pass, which was a very difficult route at the time. There wasn't nothing like a paved road. It was more like a mule path that they could pull wagons across, to the miners in Wairika and today's Happy Camp area. And the miners, particularly after a winter where all they'd had was pork products, and no vegetables, no fruits, would pay in gold to get those wagon loads of apples bought off, or things of that sort, melons and such that came from here. Other farmers, such as Michael Hanley, specialized in stock raising, although stock was raised on almost all the farms. But some farmers were more successful than others. Michael Hanley here at Hanley raised mules. And these mules were moved overland as far east as Winnemucca, as far south as Chico, because that's where the great fairs took place and where animals could be traded and bought. And this was all before there was any sort of railroad. It wasn't until 1884 that the railroad first arrived. The railroad was going to actually come through Hanley Farm, at least they thought it might. But the railroad engineers, as was typical, preferred a straight line run. Distance and cost meant money, was money. And they ran pretty much a ruler edge line right up the center of the valley, and it passed where it does today. And along the way, it created certain towns, like Central Point. There was a Central Point, but it was east of where it is today. Medford did not exist. That's a railroad town. Talent and Phoenix sort of existed. There were little hamlets. But once they were on the railroad, things changed, and the agricultural situation changed. because to begin with, farmers could use it for local transport, and we wouldn't think too much of that, except you have to realize the roads were very miserable. In the summertime, they were dusty. In the wintertime, they were generally impassable, particularly with rains. But if you could just get your crops to the railroad, then it could be rolled along the railroad tracks to other parts of the valley. And so the very first shipment recorded here were apples, and they were sent from Phoenix to Central Point. And pretty soon, people in Central Point were sending grain to the grain mills at Phoenix or at Ashland. It all worked very well. But the real markets were to the north and the east. By 1887, stockmen here were shipping cattle as far east as Montana, because the route of the railroad out of the valley was not south as we might imagine, it was north. It was north to Portland, and then east on the Northern Pacific, basically to Minneapolis, and then from there on to Chicago, on to the East Coast. By the year 1900, the crops had changed considerably, and we'll see in just a moment what that did as a result of the railroad. But railroad and agriculture go hand in hand. Otherwise, it would have been a lot of small farms barely holding on. With the coming of the railroad, also came new outsiders, and there were two individuals of note, or two sets of them that came. The first were the Weeks brothers. They came in 1883, just before the railroad opened, but they were alert to its prospects. And he was actually an architect from Oakland, but he must have been a very alert one, because he bought himself a ranch. And in those days, a farm and a ranch were pretty much the same thing. Every farm was a ranch, every ranch was a farm. And he began planting orchards. 2 years later, just after the railroad was opened, another gentleman named Stewart came, and he came from Quincy, Illinois, and he was a professional horticulturalist, which was a whole new breed of cat. He also purchased property near Phoenix and immediately began putting in a nursery. And pretty soon he was selling trees to other farmers. But in general, there was reluctance of the traditional mixed-use farm or farmer to be attracted to this new effort of planting fruit trees for the reason that they couldn't see where there could ever be a market for them. Well, they kind of misjudged the prospects that were opened up by the railroad. To bring a fruit tree into bearing mode, it takes between 4 and 6 years. And so it was a fair amount of time before the various fruit trees that had been planted were actually yielding fruit. But once they did, then shipments began almost immediately to markets in the Portland area and east. And this just continued, and it just wasn't to the East Coast. It was to Europe and the world, and that was because of shipping. But the fruit from Southern Oregon was extremely high quality. And these early horticulturalists made an effort to keep it that way, largely by only shipping to the distant markets very good quality fruit. Poorer fruit might be used, often they would feed apples to the hogs, for that matter, or not even sold at all, or sold in the local market. But Southern Oregon developed a reputation for very fine, fancy fruit. We see that today with Harry and David, but Harry and David hardly invented it. They also invested in the quality packing of the fruits, using boxes made of exotic materials, or putting paper doilies around the plants, individually wrapping the plants. The way they were displayed was very important. The result was that by 1900, fruit from Oregon was being eaten routinely in London and Berlin and Calcutta, Shanghai, virtually all over the world, and in every major city in the United States. Fruit was aided by some other factors. One of them was the creation of the Oregon Experiment Station, which today we know as the Extension Service, and this was established in Corvallis in the late 1880s. and it began producing a series of scientific studies of different aspects of agriculture. It wasn't just the fruit industry that was being favored. They did cattle, they did wheat and cereal crops, but it certainly benefited fruit, and some of their advice, we'll see in a moment, brought about some what today we might consider less positive changes, but at the time they were very important. You have to realize that the general spirit of agriculture at this time is traditionalist. It did things the way they were done in the South or the way they were done in the Midwest. The idea of experimentation meant perhaps rotating a different crop, but crops you were familiar with. It was a fairly big thing when in the 1860s, particularly at Hanley Farm, alfalfa, then known as Chilean clover, was introduced. Chilean clover, or alfalfa, is basically a grain, and most of the grains raised were for animals. It was only in the 1880s with the railroad that it became possible to plant large acreages in wheat and sell it. If you could, you'd get it milled because the milled grain was more valuable than the raw grain, and then ship it to the north. The problem with even something like grain was competition, because you're always dealing with the market. And between us and shipping to the high seas, which is where most grain was destined for Europe or India even, you had the Willamette Valley, and they were able to easily outproduce Southern Oregon in grain and do so at less cost, less shipping costs. But the fruit was something they couldn't match, and it was the fruit industry that continued to grow. By the mid-1890s, there were still far more shipments of grain out of here than fruit. But the fruit was able to yield about 10 times more income per acre than the grain was able to do. And so the wealth was going to the horticulturalists, to the orchardists. There were significant cultural changes underlying all this, and that was, we're talking about a different breed of person engaged in this agricultural endeavor between the traditional farmers, who often were Southerners, particularly here, Southern Democrats in those days, and generally favored the South in the Civil War just because of where they came from. And these two generations later, arrival of individuals with money buying up old farmland or farmland that had gone bankrupt because of economic issues and converting it to orchards. It took quite a bit of capital to build an orchard or create an orchard because you had to deal with 4 or 5 years of non-productivity. That's something the farmers were used to just getting along, simply were not able to do. They could do things collectively, they'd form cooperatives, they could share equipment, they would rent the same threshers, they'd move from one farm to the next, but everything was done on very tight margins. All of a sudden now you have new individuals who many times were retired businessmen who come here to this garden land, open up these lovely orchards, and sit back and wait for them to start producing fruit. There are also differences in the social interests of these individuals. Often, the orchardists, very often, and it increased as time went forward, did not really live on their orchards at all. Or if they did, they had a fancy house, but they were not working the orchards. They'd hire managers, and the managers would hire labor. So you had a different social class. This class was much more comfortable hobnobbing with bankers and with editors and with lawyers, businessmen in town. That was the world they knew. And the farmers were used to living in fairly isolated existences and had their own sets of values of hard work, self-reliance. But you can see that the two were not necessarily great bedmates. They did impact one another. The cities began to grow, largely because of the publicity that went with the orchards. That improved the local market for the farmers. But it also had negative impacts. the cost of labor increased, and that was significant because most farms employed very few workers during most of the year. It was only during the harvest season that they needed fairly large gangs, because harvesting, even with reapers and stuff, you still had to bundle up the grain into shocks, and then it would be threshed. But the harvest season for the cereal crops was taking place about the same time as the harvest season for the pear crops. And the price of labor went up, and the orchardists could absorb it, the farmers less so, and that did not help. One of the common misunderstandings about the orchards here is that the pear reigned supreme, that it was always the pear that was the true orchard crop. Originally, it was quite a bit more diverse, and this lasted up until about 1930. The first orchards that were common here were apples. Most farms actually had orchards. There were orchards here. The orchards were not particularly tended. They weren't pruned. They'd produce some fruit. Some of it could be sold. It wasn't very high quality. But when the orchardists came in, they also planted apples, and by taking care of them, by draining their fields, by just good practice, horticultural practice, they were able to produce good apple crops, and that was significant. Another crop that was developed, particularly in the Ashland area, were peaches, and Ashland produced some of the finest peaches in the country for quite a while. And all the hills above Ashland, particularly to the north, were covered with such orchards. There were some grapes grown here. These were pretty long-standing. Many farms had small vineyards. There's a vineyard right near where I'm sitting here today. But that was mostly a home industry. It was not anything for particular import. There was an attempt made to export brandy by one of the Hanley children, and it didn't really succeed. Cherries were grown with some success. And then eventually the pear, by 1900, the pear became more and more predominant. Between 1900 and 1910, we have a major new element that takes place, and that is the advent of boosterism. Boosterism was a kind of a phenomenon that swept cities throughout the country. It was very common. It was synonymous with development. And absolute loyalty to the wonders of your particular town. You can see towns, I'm thinking of something showing Pittsburgh, California, on the Sacramento River, with these massive smokestacks spewing smoke. It has to be about the ugliest thing you could think of, except that it was touted as the Pittsburgh of the West, because that was development. Every town had something, and they would invest quite a bit of money in the advertising, and everyone was expected to speak the party line, and that is, write to all your friends and neighbors and tell them this is the place, come here. Medford was particularly adept at it, so it wasn't that what Medford was doing was unique. What Medford did was do it well, and it also had something unusual to talk about. It had the extraordinarily fertile lands here of southern Oregon. It also had crops that were worldwide and had a reputation. And it had a very dynamic set of civic leaders, particularly in the Medford area, that were building the town rapidly. Medford was the first fully paved city in Oregon. It at one time had more cars per capita, they said, than any city in the United States. It had 600 telephones. It was an up-and-coming place, and the people flocked in. They flocked in by the thousands. They flocked in where it became in such a degree that it became impossible to find lodging. People slept in tents on the lawn at the station, the railroad station in town. Tent City was put up near, under what is today or at the site of today's Jackson County Courthouse. And still there was not enough room, there were not enough jobs, And the goal of everyone was to invest in pear orchards. And orchards were put in places that were unconscionable. On what was known as the Desert to Farmers, which is today the area a little bit east of White City, the Sticky, where it's mostly just clay, dynamite was used to poke holes in the ground so that apple orchards could be planted. An orchard of some 10,000 acres was planted along the side of Roxanne, touted as the largest orchard in the world, and quickly subdivided so that everyone could go buy their own little portion of it, which soon enough went bankrupt, as did many of these ventures. The bankruptcy, the breakdown, the bubble burst in the year 1913. It was not just the result of overbuilding, or overinvesting in orchards, which was part of it, but there were climatic and infestation issues that were fairly extreme. I need to back up and talk a little bit about the problems of pests. Though the promoters of orchards were always ready to share the beauties of this new Garden of Eden, in which they were planting their trees and raising their beautiful crops, their beautiful fruits, there was an underside to the tale, a much darker underside that generally was not much spoken about, although it's fairly common in the local press because there was no way to hide it. And that is that there were problems of slugs, there were problems of fungus called San Jose blight, and insect infestation, mites and spiders and things, which on a bad year could cause enormous damage to a fruit crop. When an investor had put a lot of money into the crop, it became pretty serious that if the yields are plummeting, that something be done. And this was recognized quite early, and the Oregon Experiment Station, which was a state and federally funded laboratory for best practice, by 1890 was encouraging farmers to spray their crops. Now, the early sprays were mixtures of soap and other fairly innocuous materials that were used to coat the trees. They'd be sprayed with hand pumps on wagons, a pretty arduous process, and sort of worked. But they found it worked much better to use something called Paris green, and also there was another substance called London blue. These were the color of these items. Paris green was the most common. It was a arsenate, it was a sulfate of arsenic that was then mixed with some other kind of powders, such as flour or even ashes, and then diluted fairly significantly with water. I mean, this was not solid poison, but it was poison. And this was used, and it was used constantly. And as late as 1910, some farmers were spraying their fields up to 8 times a season, the same fields. And on a bad year, they were still losing from 10 to 30% of their crops. They eventually did away with the San Jose blight disease. They never did take care of the other infestations, and this was a constant problem. And today this issue continues, and it's largely driven by economics, not always by the wisest environmental sense, but it was very much a part of this. And impact on workers and such of these working with the insecticides, pesticides, is not reported. It'd be somewhat difficult to trace, but it'd be an interesting topic. A second dimension that helped the advance of the orchards were the railroads, as I mentioned, but it was a dimension of the railroads that is easily overlooked, and that's the advent of refrigerator cars. Refrigerator cars used natural ice, often hacked out of lakes like at Truckee and transported all over the West. And then later, ice plants were made which could generate ice, and there was one such a plant in Medford. In about 1902, the Southern Pacific Railroad determined that the produce, the orchard products from Southern Oregon were of such value, such market value, that they would make Medford a major center of fruit transport. Up until this time, Ashland was the major railroad center in Southern Oregon, and in many ways that continued to be, but not for the fruit industry. 50 of these new state-of-the-art refrigerator cars were assigned just to Medford. Medford was given its own switching engine to handle the many side tracks that were put in place. The cars would be ice loaded and immediately sent either north-south. The Southern Pacific system at that time was connected with the Union Pacific, and en route, a traffic bureau would divert the shipments to the best market. So they might be destined for Chicago and it ended up in New Orleans, or destined for New York and it ended up in Toronto. But this feature of the combination of the fine products of the valley and a really remarkable transportation system for its era did wonders to the revenues that the fruit was able to produce. The collapse of 1913 resulted in a major reduction in car loadings, the number of cars per year that were loaded. As we see here on this chart, it plummeted downward. Remarkably though, if you look, you'll see that by 1914 and then thereafter, it continues to climb, climbing to an ever higher level. The difference after 1914, however, there were several. One was that the European market and the world market, which had been so valuable up to this point, was no longer accessible. During the war, fruit was not being shipped to Europe. The other factor was that the market prices for the fancy fruit were no longer what they were before. The reason the crops were increasing was because most of them, or virtually all of them, had been planted during the boom. They were planted in 1909 and were not coming to bear until 1914. So you can see once again that delayed effect of the time it took to make things flower. So even though you had orchards being uprooted, orchards weren't even being harvested, crops were being just left on the ground, you were still shipping more than ever before, but the earnings were no longer there. By 1920, which is the end of this overview, we really have two phenomena in Southern Oregon. They're both about equal strength. The one which received most of the credit or attention is, of course, the fruit industry, which was, it had all the big names, all the money, and all the excitement. But the conventional farming with relatively small, 150-acre or so average traditional farms was quite strong through this period. The farms were working with mixed crops and animals. You also had a significant ranching industry, and the net earnings of either orchards or farms were about the same. By 1920, even with the advent of the automobile engine, the diesel engine, trucks, tractors, and so on, most of the heavy work at farms was still being done with animals. And with the thousands of animals in use on the farms, that dictated quite a bit what was being planted. The oats and the barley for the horses, corn for the hogs, things of that sort, which were just part of that self-contained system. By 1930, that had begun to change, but that's another time and another place. Things have changed considerably since 1920. In effect, we have almost another history that begins at this point, one which would be much more understandable to the contemporary farmers than what I have described. What has not changed, however, is the wonders of the land. The fertile land of the Rogue Valley from the beginning to today has always been a major asset here. The land allowed for the grasses that kept the great herds of sheep and cattle, dairy cattle, meat cattle, fed. It was the lands that permitted the valley to be dotted with wheat crop, and it was the lands that made the orchards productive. Today, situations change. A major crop is our vineyards today. Cannabis has an undefined but very important role in our economy, but all of these are products of the bounty of the land. Thank you very much. This has been a delight to make this presentation.